very much. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to speak briefly, and then I hope you'll ask me questions. We can take advantage of the fact that we have a group that'll, small enough to do that. So now in my role as an author, for the first time, I get asked this question: why did you write this book? It's like the starting question I get asked, and I wanted to think in a genuine way about where the kernel for the book really comes. What was the experience that started us down this path? And I think it's a moment in Geneva about 5 or 6 years ago when I was there to talk to the World Trade Organization about helping to stop overfishing and stop ocean collapse. And we went to see the Chinese trade representative in Geneva. It's quite interesting in Geneva. All the big 150 countries of the world represented there for international discussions about managing the world's trade. The United States Embassy is surrounded by perimeters of fences, and the Chinese embassy is open. You walk in. You meet the Chinese ambassador then, who was about 35 years old, very distinguished young man, very well dressed. We sit down with him and we said, we have a bad history as a planet in managing the oceans. They are collapsing. And he said, we have 1 billion people in China. They're very hungry. We're going to feed them. You guys have gotten your chance. We need to make sure we can feed our people. It was a very sincere and strong message on behalf of the food side of the equation. And I went away and thought about it and say, okay, so there we have two very morally compelling goals. Protect life on the planet, the traditional conservation agenda, protect biodiversity, or feed people. Make sure people aren't hungry. Make sure that in the year 2050, when there are 2 billion more people on the planet, we don't have children waking up hungry everywhere. We have nearly 1,950 million people now waking up hungry frequently on the planet. So this is not an imaginary problem. Now, if you think about the origin of the conservation movement, it goes back about 100, 150, 120 years ago, and it starts on the land. And on the land, if you ask the question, what is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss on the planet? The answer is agriculture. This is the reason that we are losing species. It's the chief reason we are losing species on the land. And so the history of the conservation movement is because there's a fundamental moral kind of war between feeding people and protecting life, that you kind of choose sides. And the conservationists' side is we're going to protect biodiversity, and if that means we have to stand against agriculture, we'll stand against agriculture. Because we don't see on the land that you can simultaneously optimize for food production and for biodiversity protection. So there's a kind of a war in people's heads that comes from the land-based experience of conservation. And when we went into the ocean, when the conservation movement went into the ocean, about 30 years ago, and your colleague Jennifer is one of, therefore can date, herself to being one of the early pioneers of thinking about the ocean, because it's really only about 30 years old. That mindset was taken with us. So we went into the ocean and we thought the job of optimizing food production at the ocean cannot be simultaneously optimized with the job of biodiversity production in the ocean. You have to make a choice just because we're used to making that choice on the land. That framework drove the conservation agenda in opposition to the food production agenda in the ocean. Now, we are right now on a path where we are getting fewer fish from the ocean every year, despite increasing efforts to catch them, despite using advanced technologies of all sorts to track down and catch fish. The world's fishery catch, just in tonnage, peaked in the late 1980s and has been coming down. You've heard of peak oil? Well, we've crossed peak fish, wild fish. At a moment when we have all these hungry people, you would want that to be going the other direction. That opportunity turns out to be real. And the message of the book is that if we will manage our oceans well, we can have a future by 2050 that is different in this very quantifiable way. We are on a path to be feeding about 450 million seafood meals a day in the year 2050 if we stay on the path we're on. If we manage the oceans better, we can do 800 million meals a day. And if we stopped feeding fish to pigs and animals, it could be 1 billion people a day, forever, being fed healthy seafood meal. So we have that's the order of magnitude of the choice, that we're 450 million versus on the order of 1 billion people a day, a seafood meal every single day. Now, how do we do that? How do we get there? Now, the common idea now in all of your heads, unless you're way more advanced than the typical group that I've talked to about, which you may be since we are here at Google, is that you're thinking about the map of the world and you're thinking, the map of the world's oceans looks like a pretty international place. It looks to me, as a naive observer of the world's oceans, that we are only going to manage the oceans well if we construct international committees to collaborate around the rules and enforce the rules for managing fishing, because that's the way the map looks. And if you're a practical person, you would be discouraged, because we don't do a very good job in the world, sadly, at doing international management of anything. We don't do a very good job of international management of stopping killing people, let alone too much killing of fish. So how could you as a practical person get excited about the job of producing all this seafood for the future? Here's the very good news for you. It turns out that life in the ocean is not equally distributed. 7 out of 8 pounds of the world's wild fish are caught in the coastal zones of the oceans. Now, that is a surprising insight, because the most charismatic fish in the ocean are, like the most charismatic creatures on the land, big predators, lions and tigers of the ocean. And like lions and tigers on the land, they have big territories. And they have the tendency to spend a lot of their life out in the international zone of the seas, which is called the high seas. And indeed, they do need to be protected by international cooperation. So the tunas, the sharks that we think of as, and we love, are in fact extremely vulnerable. And the future will struggle to see many of those, because they do require us to do what we don't do well, international agreements. But here's the good news from the point of view of food. The coastal zones of the world's oceans are controlled country by country by the adjacent country. Every coastal country out to 200 nautical miles by itself sets the rules for what happens in that ocean with respect to fishing. Nobody fishes within 200 nautical miles of the United States coast without fishing under the rules that the Americans set. So they have to fish with our quota rules, they have to fish with our habitat protection rules, they have to comply with our bycatch rules. You cannot overfish the American Ocean because the Spanish come in and decide they want to fish our ocean. It's not a tragedy of the commons in that classic way where nobody's in charge. The Americans are in charge of their ocean. The Chileans are in charge of their ocean. The Europeans are in charge of their ocean, and on and on and on. And in fact, by the way, interesting fact, the country in the world with the biggest coastal territory by square miles is the United States of America. So if you're an American, you can think of yourself as having more opportunity than the average citizen of the world to influence the future of this part of the world's natural systems. From the point of view of food, though, we want to ask the question, how many countries would it take to do a good job managing their ocean fishery, to deliver the ocean intact and abundant to the year 2050, to feed all these people that are going to be here then healthy seafood meals, delicious seafood meals like we had today in the Google cafeteria. And so we at Oceana made a list with the countries with the biggest catch from their coastal zones at the top and the ones with the smallest catch by weight at the bottom. And we asked the question, if the top 10 countries on that list, just the top 10 countries on that list, were to do a good job managing their oceans, what share of the world's wild fish catch could we deliver in a healthy state to the future? And the answer is 2/3. 9 countries in the European Union together control the catch of 2/3 of the wild fish catch by weight. The tunas and the swordfish are not, they're charismatic and they're important, but by weight, they don't contribute as much as you would think. And from the point of view of feeding people, weight is what we're concerned about, weight of healthy animal protein.
When you say weight, do you say weight that goes to human consumption or also like farms and pigs and everything?
The question is, when I say weight, am I talking about weight fish that gets fed directly to people, or including stuff that gets fed to animals? And I'm talking about the catch, no matter where it gets delivered to. And so that question points to another interesting fact, and I mentioned it earlier. We have a big opportunity in the future to feed people by stopping or reducing the practice of feeding fish to fish or feeding fish to animals. Let me just address that directly. Very often, people will say, isn't the solution to overfishing of the oceans farming of fish? And when I eat a farmed fish, aren't I doing something that's good for the ocean? And intuitively, it sounds like you are. In fact, you have to ask the following question. What does the fish that you are eating, that is farmed, what does it eat? And the answer to that question creates 3 categories that are basically bad, good, bad, and indifferent, depending upon what the fish eats. If the fish eats fish, that's a problem category. If the fish eats grain, it's a kind of a neutral category. If the farmed fish eats algae, like oysters, clams, mussels do, that's basically an unalloyed good thing. So what's a fish that eats a lot of fish, that's farmed a lot, that we eat a lot of? Salmon. This is a carnivore. Salmon eats other fish. And I've been to the salmon pens in Chile, and they take wild fish, grind them up into little pellets that look like dog food, but smell like fish, and they feed them to the farmed salmon in the pens, and in the process they convert 4 or 5 pounds of wild salmon into 1 pound of farmed fish. So it's a reduction activity. By contrast, by happy contrast, the farmer of mussels, the farmer of clams, the farmer of oysters is creating a healthy and delicious seafood out of something that eats algae. It's not something human beings eat or livestock generally eat. And, by the way, in so doing, cleans the ocean because it's a filter feeder. And, by the way, it's even better because it's that rarest of things in the world. It's a for-profit company with employees and with profits and with all the connections that profitable businesses have to the political establishment, which must have a clean ocean. Because if you're farming oysters in a polluted ocean, they don't taste good or they die. So we, as people who want there to be an abundant ocean, encourage you to eat as many farmed salmon, as many as farmed mussels, mussels, clams, and oysters as you can stomach. Go today and eat mussels tonight. There's a recipe for them in my book. And there were some today at the cafeteria, one of those recipes, clams. So, we talked about 9 countries plus the European Union. I want to address an important fact. You're wondering if I slipped something tricky in there by saying the European Union, because you will know that there are 27 countries in the European Union. So I didn't finesse this by getting 9 plus 27 to sound like 10. The European Union manages its fisheries on a continental basis out of Brussels. The rules for all 27 member states on quotas, habitat, and bycatch, on overfishing or not, are set in one place by one set of decision makers in Brussels. So for purposes of fishery management, it's authentic and legitimate to treat the European Union as one country. So 9 countries plus the European Union, if they will stop overfishing, can manage 2/3 of the world's fish by weight and can deliver those in healthy state to the future. If you go to 25 countries, counting the European Union as a country, which is the correct way to count it for fisheries purposes, you get to 90% of the world's wild fish by weight. So this is a very doable thing. We can. It comes down to 10 decision makers doing basically one thing, stopping overfishing, to make sure all this natural, healthy seafood is available for the future. Now, I want to point out one last thing. In the forecasts for the planet between now and 2050, there is an optimistic plan that the middle classes are going to grow, and that there will be a big expansion in the middle class of China, Brazil, India. This is devoutly to be hoped for. This is a good thing. That means that, among other things, that they will be eating a lot more animal protein. And if you face up to what the consequences of expanded livestock production will be for the planet, you will be very worried. Because livestock production is one of the most intensive forms of agriculture. And remember, I talked about agriculture broadly being the enemy of biodiversity on the planet, on the land. Well, livestock production is a really tough problem for biodiversity on the land. It also is a big producer of methane, and therefore climate-forcing activity on the planet. It also is a huge demander of fresh water and aquifer depletion. So if you care about those things, climate change, aquifer depletion, deforestation, you need to care about making the ocean abundant. I assume all of us here care about feeding poor and hungry people. But if you're so hard-hearted that that's not part of your agenda and all you care about is these other things, you also have a reason to fight for an abundant ocean. I've had some people say to me, I don't really like seafood. I don't even understand how somebody in the middle of Africa who lives nowhere near seafood is going to benefit from an abundant ocean. Tell me why I should care about this. My answer is, seafood right now is equal to eggs as a source of animal protein in the human diet, A, so it's bigger than you think it is. And B, if you think that person, if you eat food, if you're a person who eats food, let's imagine that possibility. You're a person who eats food. Or you're a person in the middle of Africa who is never going to see a fish, but who is hungry. And you're concerned, that's your client in your head. You want to help that person. You can help them by making the oceans be abundant, because the price of grain in the year 2050 will be different if we have an abundant ocean or not, because livestock production is a big demander of grain. And so the price of a taco, the price of a loaf of bread, will be different in the year 2050 and better and more affordable for that person in the middle of Africa if we have an abundant ocean. So I really want the world to see this opportunity, and I really want us to capture it. The last thing I want to say, and then I'll take questions. When you think about nature, and you think about what it takes to restore nature, consider that the oceans are one of the strongest and most fertile and most robust parts of nature on the planet. Fish, many of them lay eggs by the millions. You can, and it's proven in the data, if you will stop overfishing and you will allow spawning stocks to rebuild, you can in 5 or 10 years, see measurable increases in ocean abundance. You can get to a point where you can have a bigger catch, a sustainable bigger catch, in very much in the lifetimes of everybody in this room. It's not like the longer term task of rebuilding a rainforest, which can take 100 years, if that. This is something that short attention span theater rewards. We can get there. We can get there. And we can get there in a way that's measurable. We think the blunt estimate is that the world, if well managed, if it managed its oceans well, can increase the sustainable catch on the order of 20 to 40% over the previous peak. So I talked at the beginning of my remarks about the world's fish catch peaking in the late 1980s. There is upside on top of that peak on the order of 20 to 40% if we can get these top 10 countries to do a good job. And then the fundamental point here is that the mindset that I talked about at the beginning of my remarks about the war between agriculture and biodiversity, the war between feeding people and protecting life that occurs on the land, is wrong when it comes to the ocean. Those two things are actually allies. Those two enemies are now allies. The task of feeding people wild seafood, we are eating a wild creature. So the things that we do to make the wild creatures abundant benefit the biodiversity of the ocean. The way you have a really productive ocean is you have a biodiverse ocean. So you do not have to choose if you are managing them well. Indeed, you're doing the things that are achieving both goals at once. So thank you very much. That's my quick overview of the book. I hope you will read the book. It's called The Perfect Protein. President Clinton was nice enough to write the foreword for it, partly because he helped, as Jennifer explained, to sign the laws in place in the United States that tightened our regulation of our oceans and made us one of the better ocean managers in the world. We are seeing progress around the world, and I think that this is one of those problems that the world can actually fix. Thank you very much. So I am delighted to take questions or comments.
So I have a question about, I've been to Iceland at the invitation of President Grimson and seen how they manage their fisheries successfully there. They're profitable, they're sustainable, they do sound science. So certainly when the will is there to manage a fishery effectively, it can be managed. So what do you think the most important thing that needs to happen to inspire the will to tackle the global issue, both the United States and abroad, to actually do what Iceland has done?
Well, there's good ways for this to happen, and there's bad ways for this to happen. Very often, the way the world does this is that it sees a collapse. It lets things get to the point of serious difficulty. Chile, where we have worked very, very successfully over the last 10 years, is an example of the latter. They mismanaged their industrial fleet. They collapsed their 3 biggest fisheries by allowing. The scientists would come in and recommend a quota. The fleet would say, we want a bigger quota. The government would accede to the fleet demands, and so guess what? They crashed their fisheries. After about 10 or 15 years of inability to catch their permitted quotas because they had overfished so badly, the fleet was pretty discredited. The government regulators were now in a position to see that they needed to do something different, and we were successful in January of this year in getting the law there changed from a discretionary regime to a mandatory regime. And this is basically what President Clinton did in 1995. And this is what the European Union is on the verge of doing in the next few months. In every place in the world where you have a law that says to the regulators, if you would like, you can set scientific quotas. If you would like, you can protect nursery habitat. If you choose, the law will allow you to manage bycatch. If that's the law, it doesn't work. And what we did in 1995 and what the Chileans did in January and what the Europeans are on the verge of doing is making those 3 things mandatory. And so the law says you must, if you're the regulator and the manager of this fishery, set scientific quotas, you must protect nursery habitat, you must reduce bycatch. You can get there. Chiefly the way the world gets there is by seeing in the numbers collapses and knowing that they need to make a change. That's what that's the bad path the Chileans traveled. That's the bad path the Europeans traveled. The Americans didn't let our Pacific fishery collapse before we realized that we need to make a fix, but the New England fishery got pretty badly ruined here by overfishing, so we had examples of mismanagement of our own. You can also have an upside story which is of course what the book is trying to say, which is that this is a great opportunity. There's lots of upside here from good management. People love seafood. They like to eat it. It tastes good. It's healthy for them. It's good for the planet. It's the perfect protein. And to try to get people to focus on the upside. But history would suggest that more often people have to have a brush with disaster to get motivated to do the right thing.
Can you speak, just because we're from the U.S. now, a little more about how you would actually change our practices? So in terms of, we have quota levels today. If we were to implement some of the restrictions you mentioned, how different are they than today's quotas? Would we be changing the type of fishery gathering? What other measures would you put in place? Is it the methodology? Just speak to kind of where on the food chain you'd want to select from, things like that.
So in the United States of America, the good news is, and since we're on the Pacific here, the Pacific American fisheries are pretty well managed. So we don't have big problems in the Pacific. We've done a good job there. New England fishery is a disaster, as I mentioned. We need to allow the New England fisheries to rebuild. So we need to set and enforce lower quotas there, protect some nursery habitat, especially from bottom trawling, reduce bycatch.
But like, what's like rough percentage? Are we talking like cut it by 20% or talking like 60%? What does it take for it to give it a chance to grow?
Yeah, it's hard to give you a summary answer because it's species by species, it's different, and I haven't calculated but could calculate, like if you average together the New England fisheries by weight and what the average change would be there. And then you have a decision about how fast you want the rebuild to occur. You know what I mean? There's a trade-off, like you can do the math in your head, right? There's a trade-off between a lower cut in current fishing pressure and then a faster rebound versus a smaller cut and then a slower rebuild. And that's in fact the struggle that is happening in New England right now. We would have a preference for lower cut and a faster rebuild because it's, you get more results and more fish that way. Reasonable question you're asking. I don't have the summary math in my head for New England or the United States. I do want to shift to two other things that we ought to do that your question asked about. As an individual, you ought to guide your fish consumption in the following way. Eat wild, eat small species, eat local, eat farmed shellfish wherever you can, and I'm sorry to say, don't eat any shrimp anymore. I can explain these 5 simple rules quickly. Wild, we talked about, is being better than farmed already in my answers, in my previous remarks. Farmed shellfish, we already talked about why that's good. Local, the American fisheries are generally better managed than the foreign fisheries. We import 90% of our seafood. So if you're eating local or domestic, might be more precise, you're likely eating a fish that's better managed than something coming from the rest of the world. So that's the reason to do that. And then shrimp, which is loved by America, and I love shrimp. There's just no way, almost no way, effectively there's no way to feel good about eating shrimp. If you're eating wild shrimp, you're eating something that has enormous amounts of bycatch. Shrimp are appropriately named. They're very small. So that means to catch shrimp, you have to have a small mesh net. You catch 3, 4, 5 pounds of other creatures along with each pound of shrimp. I was on CBS this morning, the week before last, the day we launched the book, and the actor who played Bubba Gump was following me. You all recognize who that was. I wanted to make this joke on TV, but I did not have time with Tom Hanks to make that joke. Farm shrimp. So if you're eating wild shrimp, you have to picture that you're also eating 3 or 4 or 5 pounds of other things, including like turtles that got caught in the shrimp nets. If you're eating farm shrimp, you're eating something that's imported typically from a tropical country where a coastal pond was created, a shallow coastal pond was created, often in a mangrove forest, filled with shrimp, fed intensively, so intensively packed in there, so swimming in their own fecal matter that high levels of pesticides and antibiotics are applied to keep them healthy, and until the point when that gets so contaminated that they have to move to a new place, create a new pond. You can fly over Belize, as I've done, and see these kind of strange zones that look like, and you don't know what they are. They're former fish, shrimp, ponds, unpleasant things to see. The last thing I want to say about what we could do in the United States of America, and your question is a very good one. We have an opportunity, because we import 90% of our seafood, to affect the conduct of the world's fleets by our buying practices. And if we would pass laws that have now been introduced into both the Senate and the House to require that all seafood sold in the United States is traceable to when it was caught, where it was caught, how it was caught, we would make it very hard for illegally sourced fish to get into our supply chain. And illegally sourced fish are on the order of 10 to 25% of the world's catch. Fish caught out of quota, in the wrong place, and so forth. If we had a strict traceability regime, those illegal fishermen would have trouble documenting that their catches were legal, and they wouldn't be able to sell them to us. And they would have a self-interested reason, because they want to sell to us, to fix their practices. Senator Begich from Alaska has introduced a bill in the Senate to do this. Congressman Markey has introduced a bill in the House to do this. They're called the Safe Seafood Act. We would like you to contact your representatives, your senators, and encourage them to co-sponsor these bills to get them through Congress. We've done more seafood testing than any other organization in the country. We've tested 1,200, more than the government, 1,200 different samples of seafood around the country and discovered that on average, there's about 33% of the time what you bought is not what they told you it was. Now, sometimes it's a small mislabeling, sometimes it's a big mislabeling, but there's a lot of seafood fraud going on. So the Safe Seafood Fraud Act would also bring you benefits as a consumer. It would stop you from being defrauded, while also delivering conservation benefits to the planet. So that's one of Oceana's big priorities this year, and we'd love to have your help on that. But our fishery management rules are in good shape. Yes?
Could you talk through an example where a fishery collapsed, good practices were put in place, and it actually recovered?
When I started developing the argument that is in the book, I would review this with Oceana's board of directors, the argument, as we were starting to figure it out. And they said, just what you said, right here. They said, Andy, could you give us some case examples of fishery rebounds, please? And a scientist on our board, who's a very distinguished scientist, said, you're asking Andy to prove that gravity works. And they said, yes, we are. Please prove that gravity works. So I went out and I got some case examples of fisheries that had been mismanaged and wrecked and had then rebounded. And there are many of them. It's not hard to find them. There are 4 of them in this little pamphlet, which we will hand out to you, and you can, I can show you these charts here. We famously call these charts U-charts because they go down and then they go up. And in each of these cases, which I can call out to you, there was like a 40 or 50 year period of mismanagement. The first one here is the Norwegian Arctic cod, which was badly managed by the Norwegians. They drove the spawning stock way down and kept it down by mismanagement. In the 1980s, they imposed a discard ban, and it rebounded in 5 or 10 years. This next example is the New Zealand rock lobster. From 65 until about 90, badly mismanaged, catch limits imposed. In the 90s, it comes back. This next example is the Norwegian herring. Fishing limits put on. After bad mismanagement, it recovered. And this is U.S. haddock, which was really astoundingly mismanaged by the United States, punished badly, and in about 1995, remember that? President Clinton and Senator Stevens get together in the days when bipartisan action was possible, and that fishery rebounded. So 5 or 10 years in the scientific data, evidence of recovery. I love that question. I mean, this is not a theoretical exercise. This is in the data over and over again. Now, there is a famous counterexample. Do you know what the famous counterexample is?
Canadian cod?
Yes. You're well done. The famous counterexample is Canadian cod, which were badly overfished by the Canadians and by some European fleets. The Canadians finally imposed tight restrictions on it, and it has not come back. And it is the classic nightmare scenario of a fishery that was once hugely important. So, produced huge cod that were 5 or 6 feet long, so important to the early development of the United States that we named a part of our country after them, Cape Cod. That fishery has not come back. Nobody really knows why. You can speculate that some other creature came into the ecological niche that the cod occupied, and now the cod can't get going again. But that is the exception. We do not need to be, we have to, it's like what I was talking about tunas and swordfish earlier. Please don't be misled by the exceptions to the rules. This is happily, this is an exception because it's a nightmare story.
Is this an exception because they waited too long?
Nobody really knows why it's an exception. It could be that they waited too long, but if you look at these other examples that I held up here, some of them are badly mismanaged over the course of 20, 30 years. So, and yet they were able to recover. It's probably that there was some other phenomenon that people don't fully understand, like I said, that something moved in there and was able to take root. It's also possible that the trawling, the heavy trawling in that area, bottom trawling had a really serious effect. Nobody really knows, because it is an unusual counterexample.
So in your discussion here, you're talking about trying to feed the global population, and you talk a lot about fish. What else from the ocean? Is there a role for things like algae and kelp and things like that in your vision of feeding the global population over the next century?
Short answer would be yes, but the long answer is I don't know a lot about that. I mean, I think that they can, from what little I know, I think that they can be sustainably and usefully, managed in a way that's sensible and doesn't create huge problems. You may know more about that than I do, but we have to learn to like to eat algae, which I would expect would be a difficult challenge. I don't know about kelp. So short answer is yes. I would be an optimist on that, but that's not based on an informed study of it. So the question is, just for the microphone, is can I talk more about what people should be eating and changes that are required there? So you anticipated the answer. Eat lower down on the food chain where you can. So smaller species fish, anchovies, sardines would be great. I talked about farm mussels, oysters, clams. Eat all those you can. Don't eat big predator fish if you want a simple rule of thumb. Try to, if you really have an appetite for information, you can use these food guides. And the Monterey Aquarium and the Blue Ocean Institute have food guides which are quite helpful. There's applications you can get for your remote device that'll tell you in the grocery store what to choose. Many people don't have the patience or the time to do that, but if you're one of them, more power to you. That's a good thing to do. Part of the idea of the perfect protein was to give people these simple rules that they could kind of apply in a busy life, like eat small fish, eat wild fish, eat farmed shellfish if you can, don't eat shrimp. We have recipes in the book, 21 recipes in the book that show you how to prepare something you might not think would be tasty, and I think I encourage you to try them and learn. I hope that you like these things that you might not have thought you'd like. Sardines might be an example of that. Most people might not think a sardine would be tasty, but it can be. I prepared, when I was on this show, I mentioned CBS This Morning, Eric Ripert, the famous chef of Le Bernardin, which is one of the most prestigious French restaurants in the country, in Manhattan, was on with me. He has a recipe in the book. And he was the poissonnier at the Tour d'Argent in maybe the most famous French restaurant in the world in Paris. He knows a hell of a lot about fish. And I said to him, Eric, I cooked your recipe on Friday night, which I had done. I had gotten the clams and andouille sausage recipe out of it, which is also served today. And I prepared it at home, much to my wife's and my daughter's amazement, because I'm really not very much of a cooking kind of guy. And except for the fact that I hadn't really scrubbed the clams to get all the sand out, it was quite good. So the last thing on this point is, we live at a moment of time when there's a lot of foodieism, abroad. We have chefs have become kind of heroes of the day. They're celebrities on television. People are interested in food preparation. There's an ongoing incentive in that world for marketing innovation, for bringing to people tastes that they haven't had before, things to eat that they haven't tried before. And so I think we have the wind at our back in terms of encouraging people to eat lower down on the food chain, because the food industry likes to innovate. So when we come to them and say, try out some of these unusual creatures that are listed in the book, they say, great, And so we have 21 famous chefs, each offering a different recipe for things that you might not want to, you might not have thought it would taste good.
This is sort of a personal challenge that I feel like might get reflected globally. So I'll tell my friends like, hey, bluefin tuna, you should really not be eating that, running out, endangered, etc. And their response is like, yeah, so it's all going to be gone. We better eat it while it's still here, right? And I hear rumors about like overfished quotas in, say, Asia, where you have fishermen like stockpiling so that they can sell it when it's not available literally anymore. Right. How do we deal with that?
The problem of the Atlantic bluefin tuna is a counterexample to everything I've said here. It's a top predator fish. It has the misjudgment to swim across national boundaries all the time. Maybe we could teach it, you know, to like live its life inside national territory. It is a high value fish, so the financial incentives to go catch it and sell it, as you mentioned in your question, are huge. Individual high quality specimens can sell for, you know, the cost of a house. Not a house in Palo Alto, but a house, you know, somewhere else. They are very vulnerable. They are in a tough spot, and I'm worried about them. But I don't want the exception, which they are, on a basis of the oceans by weight, the oceans as a source of animal protein by weight. They are an exception to the general rule. And so the problems that we see with Atlantic bluefin tuna management and overfishing do not apply to most species. And so be optimistic about the rest of, you know, so many other species. Meanwhile, if you want to help on Atlantic bluefin tuna, there is a place there's an international committee that has all of the weaknesses that you suspect it would have, called ICAT, the acronym, which sets the quotas for Atlantic bluefin catches. The International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna. The United States is a member of that body, along with about more than 20 other countries, and they tend to do a terrible job. They tend to have lowest common denominator outcomes that they don't vigorously enforce, and they have allowed this fishery to be badly managed. And it's, you know, the Atlantic is at about a 15% of an unfished ocean number in terms of its population of Atlantic bluefin. So they're at a dangerous point. I hope they come back. We, like many other conservation groups, press the governments who are on ICAT to lower quotas, to allow rebuilding. If you're a responsible person, you should be contacting your government and getting them to do that. And I hope they will. But that's a creature in a tough spot. Jennifer suggesting that the U.S. could ban imports of Atlantic bluefin tuna as a contribution. There might be trade WTO implications to that decision that would get the United States in trouble with the WTO. I don't know. There would be complexity there. Yeah. Since that's a globally eaten commodity, that might end up being that might not be enough, even that, because the quota that we didn't take would go somewhere else. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope this is interesting, and I hope you'll buy my book, our book, promote it. We would like lots of people to get the message, and I hope you'll enjoy some of the recipes in the back. Thanks very much.